A new beginning shrouded in prejudice. Marcus Carter's family stood in awe as they took in their new home. Nestled in the heart of an affluent suburban neighborhood, the house was everything they had dreamed of, spacious, modern, and surrounded by well-manicured lawns. The move marked a monumental achievement for Marcus and his wife, Danielle. After years of hard work, Marcus as a prominent software engineer and Danielle as a respected surgeon, they had finally created the life they had envisioned for their children, 12-year-old Naomi and 7-year-old James. The day had been long but joyous, filled with unpacking and the sounds of children exploring every corner of the house. As the sun began to set, Danielle called everyone in for dinner. Over steaming plates of pasta, laughter and plans for the future filled the dining room. However, amidst their excitement, an unspoken tension lingered. From the moment they arrived, Marcus couldn't ignore the watchful eyes of their neighbor, Mr. Turner. He had been the first to greet them, or rather, confront them, when they moved in. Turner's handshake was firm, but his eyes lacked warmth, scanning Marcus as if sizing him up. "New to the neighborhood?" Turner asked, his tone devoid of friendliness. "Yes," Marcus replied with a smile, extending his hand. "I'm Marcus, and this is my wife, Danielle. We're thrilled to join the community." Turner nodded stiffly. "Well, we like to keep things quiet and orderly around here." Marcus had brushed off the encounter, chalking it up to Turner being a grumpy old man. But as the days passed, the stares and whispers began to mount. While jogging one morning, he overheard snippets of conversations between neighbors. "Have you seen the new family? Wonder how they afforded that place. Probably temporary. People like that don't usually stay long." Marcus's jaw clenched, but he kept running. He was determined not to let prejudice rob his family of their happiness. They had earned their place here just like anyone else. A week after moving in, Danielle hosted a small gathering for their immediate neighbors, hoping to break the ice and establish a sense of camaraderie. She prepared an assortment of hors d'oeuvres and decorated their backyard with string lights. Most of the attendees were polite, even kind, but a few, including Turner, remained aloof. He stayed for less than an hour, barely touching his drink, before leaving with a curt nod. As the gathering wound down, Danielle sighed. "It went well, don't you think?" "It did," Marcus agreed, though his thoughts lingered on Turner. "But some people might need a little more time." Danielle smiled. "We'll win them over eventually. Just wait." But eventually seemed farther away than they had hoped. The turning point came late one evening, just as the Carters were settling in for dinner. Loud, urgent knocking echoed through the house, startling everyone. Marcus opened the door to find two police officers standing there, flanked by Mr. Turner. "Good evening," one officer said, his tone curt. "We received a report of suspicious activity at this address." Marcus blinked in disbelief. "Suspicious activity? We've been inside all evening having dinner. What's this about?" Turner stepped forward, his expression smug. "I saw people moving around in the yard earlier. Looked shady to me. Just doing my duty as a neighbor." Marcus felt his chest tighten. His children peeked around the corner, their wide eyes filled with fear. Danielle quickly ushered them back into the dining room, but not before James whispered, "Daddy, are we in trouble?" "No, son," Marcus said firmly, though his hands trembled slightly. "Everything's fine." He turned back to the officers, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "This is our home. We moved in last week. There's nothing suspicious here." The officers exchanged glances, their postures stiff. "Do you have any identification?" Marcus retrieved his wallet and handed over his driver's license, biting back the urge to argue. He knew better than to escalate the situation. After several tense minutes, the officers handed his ID back. "Everything checks out," one of them said, though his tone lacked apology. "Sorry for the inconvenience." As they left, Turner lingered on the porch, his smirk unwavering. Just looking out for the neighborhood, he said before walking away. Marcus closed the door, his heart pounding. Danielle appeared at his side, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This isn't right," she said softly. "We didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Marcus replied, his jaw set. "But we're not going to let him intimidate us. This is our home." Over the next few days, Marcus wrestled with how to respond. Confronting Turner directly would only escalate the situation, but ignoring it felt like conceding. He decided to take a different approach, one rooted in understanding and community. He began making an effort to engage with the other neighbors. Whether it was a friendly wave during his morning jog or striking up conversations at the local coffee shop, Marcus was determined to show them who he really was, a hard-working father, a loving husband, and a contributing member of society. To his relief, most neighbors responded warmly. A retired teacher named Mrs. Henderson invited his family over for tea, and the Millers, who lived 2 doors down, offered to help with yard work. But not everyone was so welcoming. Marcus noticed a small group, including Turner, who continued to watch him with suspicion. One afternoon, while chatting with Mrs. Henderson on her porch, Marcus learned that Turner had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years and was known for his distrustful nature. "He's always been like that," she said, shaking her head. "But don't let him get to you. You're not the first family he's tried to scare off, and sadly, you probably won't be the last." Marcus nodded, her words both comforting and troubling. He realized that Turner's actions weren't just a personal attack, they were part of a larger pattern, a reflection of deep-seated prejudice. Determined to rise above it, Marcus focused on building relationships with the supportive neighbors. He organized a community barbecue, inviting everyone in the neighborhood, including Turner. To his surprise, Turner showed up, though he kept to himself and left early. As the weeks passed, Marcus thought they might finally be turning a corner. But he soon discovered that the battle was far from over. Turner's hostility escalated, and the incidents became more frequent. Late one night, Marcus stood on his porch, staring out at the quiet street. He could feel Turner's gaze from next door, a shadowy figure barely visible through the curtains. Marcus knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he also knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let Turner's hatred define his family's story. This was only the beginning. Seeds of division and the unseen struggle. The days following the encounter with the police were a blur for Marcus and Danielle. Their peaceful world, once filled with optimism and new beginnings, had been tainted by suspicion and racial prejudice. Marcus spent hours reflecting on what had transpired, trying to make sense of the unprovoked animosity from Mr. Turner. He had worked his entire life to be where he was, to provide a better future for his family. He had earned his place in this neighborhood, yet here was a man questioning his very presence simply because of the color of his skin. In the weeks that followed, Marcus took the initiative to integrate himself more into the neighborhood, hoping that by showing his sincerity in good intentions, the whispers would quiet. He started by greeting everyone he passed during his morning jog, offering a warm smile and a nod, even when the response was nothing more than a brief, disinterested glance. He didn't mind. He was determined to be a fixture in the community, someone who wouldn't be easily ignored. Danielle, ever supportive of his efforts, joined him in attending local events like the neighborhood book club meetings and the town hall gatherings. Together, they did their best to be visible, to show that their family was just like everyone else, a family that cared about their home, their children, and the future of the community. But despite their efforts, the tension never fully dissipated. Every time Marcus stepped outside, he could feel the weight of eyes on him. Some were curious, others more guarded, but there were always a few who gave him a look that made his stomach turn. One afternoon, as Marcus mowed the lawn, he noticed Mrs. Henderson walking down the street. Her kind smile was a welcome sight, but her voice, when she called out to him, was laced with something else. "Marcus," she began, her tone hesitant, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to talk to you about something." Marcus shut off the mower and wiped his brow, giving her his full attention. "What's on your mind?" he asked, concerned by the serious undertone of her words. She glanced around, making sure no one was listening, before leaning in slightly. "It's about Turner. I'm sure you've noticed that he's been causing trouble. But it's not just you, you know. He's done this before, with other families." Marcus frowned, wondering just how deep Turner's hostility ran. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Henderson sighed, her face marked with the wisdom and weariness of someone who had seen too much in her lifetime. "A few years ago, a Hispanic family moved in down the street. Turner did the same thing to them. He called the police, told them they didn't belong, said there was something off about them. And before that, a young couple from India. It's always the same, he doesn't trust anyone who doesn't look like him." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already racing. He couldn't allow this prejudice to take root any longer. He had to act, but he knew that rushing in without a plan might only reinforce the negative perception of him. The following week, Marcus continued his efforts to reach out to the neighbors. He was determined to create allies, to form a network of people who saw past race and understood the importance of diversity and inclusion. But every conversation seemed to carry a silent weight, an invisible barrier that Marcus had to work harder to break down. One evening, as he walked with Naomi and James to the park, he overheard a conversation between two of his neighbors, Karen and Lisa. They were standing at the mailbox, their voices hushed but still audible. "Have you heard about the new family?" Karen asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. "I just don't feel comfortable with them being here. There's something off about them, don't you think?" Lisa didn't respond immediately, but Marcus could see her stiffen as she glanced in his direction. "What do you mean? They seem nice enough." Karen's voice lowered even more, as if she didn't want Marcus to hear. "I just don't think they belong here. I've seen their kids running around the yard, and Marcus, well, he just doesn't fit the image of what we expect in this neighborhood. It's a shame, but I just don't think they should be here." Marcus stood still, the words cutting through him like a blade. He didn't want to react, but the pain of hearing those words, so casual, so full of entitlement, was almost unbearable. His children were just playing, enjoying a rare moment of innocence. They didn't deserve to have their existence questioned simply because of the color of their skin. He took a deep breath, steeling himself before walking past the two women with his head held high, his children oblivious to the conversation. Later that evening, as he tucked Naomi and James into bed, he sat on the edge of their beds, his mind still racing with everything he had heard. Danielle entered the room, sensing something was off. "Marcus, what happened today?" she asked softly. He sighed and told her about the conversation he had overheard between Karen and Lisa. Danielle listened intently, her hand gently resting on his. "It's getting worse," Marcus muttered. "I don't know what to do anymore." Danielle nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "You keep doing what you're doing, staying calm, being kind, showing them who you really are. Eventually, those who matter will see the truth." But Marcus wasn't sure that waiting was enough. Turner's actions had already caused damage. The damage had spread, and it was infecting more people than he had anticipated. What made matters worse was the realization that these biases weren't isolated, they were systemic. His challenge wasn't just with Turner, but with the community at large, with the unspoken prejudices that shaped their behavior and perceptions. The next day, Marcus went to the local community center and spoke with several residents who had been friendly to him. He had made it a point to develop relationships with them over the past few weeks, knowing that they could be the key to turning things around. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm just asking for the same respect and fairness that everyone else gets. No one should have to prove their worthiness to live here based on where they come from or what they look like." Several neighbors agreed with him, and a plan began to form. It was going to be a difficult road, but Marcus had no intention of backing down. He would stand firm, not just for his own family, but for anyone else who might face the same discrimination in the future. The battle wasn't just about confronting Turner, it was about shifting the entire community's mindset. It was about proving that diversity wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. As Marcus prepared for the next chapter in his fight for equality, he knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning of a much larger journey. And he was ready. Standing tall in the face of adversity. The night after overhearing the conversation between Karen and Lisa, Marcus couldn't shake off the heavy feeling that had settled in his chest. His every interaction in this neighborhood, every seemingly harmless encounter, now felt like a covert assessment, a test of whether he, and by extension his family, truly belonged. He had always worked hard to achieve the life he had, but now it seemed that the very act of living it was under scrutiny, every look, every whispered word, every sideways glance. But Marcus knew that giving in to frustration and anger would not serve him or his family. He had to rise above. He had always been taught to be resilient, to hold his head high, no matter the obstacles. His grandfather, a proud man who had faced far worse discrimination in his lifetime, often told him, "You can't control how others see you, son. But you can control how you carry yourself. And when you walk in truth, no lie can stand against you." It was a lesson that stayed with him, even as he faced something much more insidious than he had ever anticipated. That morning, Marcus woke early, determined to keep moving forward. He didn't want to be a man of words alone, he needed to act. He decided to host a neighborhood barbecue at his house. It wasn't just a friendly gathering, it was a chance for people to see who he and his family really were, to interact with them in a relaxed, informal setting where judgments could be set aside in favor of common ground. Danielle was on board immediately. She had always been the heart of their home, the one who kept things grounded when the world outside seemed to spin out of control. Together, they planned the event, sending invitations to all the neighbors, including Mr. Turner, despite the tension that existed between them. Marcus wanted to extend an olive branch, even to the man who had caused them so much trouble. He hoped it might be the first step in clearing the air. The day of the barbecue arrived, and the air was warm and filled with the sweet smell of grilling burgers and sizzling vegetables. Marcus and Danielle worked side by side, setting up tables in the backyard, stringing up lights, and making sure there was enough food to feed everyone. Their children, Naomi and James, ran around with their friends, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. It felt like a small slice of normalcy, a moment of peace amidst the storm. But as the first guests began to arrive, Marcus couldn't help but notice the reluctance in some of their faces. It wasn't just Mr. Turner, several people arrived, greeted him with forced smiles, and then quickly found corners to huddle in with people they already knew. It wasn't overtly hostile, but it was clear that some of the residents weren't comfortable being there, weren't ready to let go of their preconceived notions about Marcus and his family. Still, Marcus pressed on. He moved around the party, talking to people, introducing himself, and making sure everyone had what they needed. Danielle did the same, offering her famous lemonade and asking everyone about their week. Slowly, the ice began to break. People began to relax, to engage in friendly conversation. Some of them shared stories about their own families, their jobs, their struggles. Marcus was patient, listening more than he spoke, observing how the mood shifted when people stopped seeing him as the new guy and began seeing him as just another neighbor. But even as the atmosphere improved, Marcus couldn't ignore the undercurrent of discomfort that seemed to swirl around a few of the guests. As the night wore on, Marcus noticed Mr. Turner standing at the edge of the yard, his arms crossed and his expression tight. He had barely acknowledged Marcus or anyone else at the party. Marcus knew that his presence, his very being, was something Turner couldn't ignore, something that still made him uneasy. As the evening wore on, the tension between them felt almost palpable. But Marcus remained calm. He had come this far with nothing but grace, and he wasn't about to let one man's prejudice ruin the goodwill that had begun to take root in the neighborhood. Around 8 p.m., just as the last of the guests were preparing to leave, Marcus found himself standing near Turner, who was still lingering by the fence, his face as unreadable as ever. Without thinking, Marcus walked over to him, extending a hand with a genuine smile. "Mr. Turner," Marcus said, his voice firm but friendly. "I wanted to personally thank you for coming tonight. I know things have been a bit tense, but I hope we can move past that. We all deserve to feel like we belong here." For a moment, Turner didn't respond. He merely stared at Marcus's outstretched hand as if it were an unfamiliar object, something that didn't belong in the space between them. But after a long, awkward pause, he shook Marcus's hand, though his grip was stiff and reluctant. "I didn't come here to make trouble," Marcus continued, keeping his tone even. "I just want to be a good neighbor. To be a part of this community. I know it might take some time, but I'm willing to work at it." Turner's eyes narrowed slightly, and Marcus could see the skepticism in them. But there was something else, something deeper, a flicker of recognition, of understanding. Maybe it was a small step forward, but it was a step nonetheless. I'll think about what you said," Turner replied, his voice low and reluctant. Marcus nodded, not expecting a complete change overnight. This was going to be a long journey, one that would require patience, persistence, and, most importantly, the willingness to keep showing up, to keep being visible despite the barriers others might try to impose. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could improve. As the night came to a close, Marcus stood on his front porch, looking out at the empty street. The barbecue had been a success in many ways, but he knew there was still much work to be done. There would be more conversations, more uncomfortable moments, and more people to convince. But he wasn't deterred. He had already proved that he wasn't just a man of words, he was a man of action. The next morning, as he sipped his coffee on the porch, Marcus noticed something that gave him hope. A neighbor he hadn't yet spoken to, Mrs. Richardson, was walking her dog and stopped at the end of his driveway. "Good morning, Marcus," she said with a warm smile. "I just wanted to say thank you for hosting that barbecue. It was really nice to see everyone coming together." Marcus smiled back, his heart lighter. "It was my pleasure. I hope we can do it again sometime soon." "I'd like that," Mrs. Richardson replied, her smile widening as she continued on her walk. It was a small moment, but it was a sign that things were changing, however slowly. The road ahead would not be easy. But Marcus was ready to keep pushing forward, to show the world that his family, their values, and their presence in this neighborhood were more than just tolerated, they were an asset. In that moment, he knew he wasn't just fighting for his own family's place in the community, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been judged, marginalized, or overlooked. He was fighting for change. And he was prepared to keep fighting for as long as it took. Unlikely alliances and shifting perceptions. In the weeks that followed Marcus's barbecue, the neighborhood began to feel different. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air, people's attitudes began to soften, and a sense of normalcy started to return. The whispers that once filled the space between neighbors began to fade, replaced by open conversations and friendly nods as Marcus jogged past familiar faces or waved from his front porch. But not everything had changed. Not everyone had forgotten the events of that first night, the knock on the door, the accusations. The shadow of suspicion still loomed over Marcus and his family. And while the majority of the neighborhood had embraced them with warm hearts and open arms, there were still those who viewed them as interlopers, unwelcome in the pristine streets and manicured lawns they called home. It was an exhausting reality. Marcus found himself walking a delicate tightrope, trying to balance his desire for peace with the need to stand firm in the face of discrimination. It was becoming clear that the work he had to do was far from over. Every day presented a new challenge, another opportunity for someone to question his place in the neighborhood. The tension that had once been veiled in whispered conversations was now creeping into more open spaces, manifesting in passive-aggressive comments or dismissive stares. Yet, despite the occasional setback, Marcus felt a strange sense of resolve. He had always believed that change didn't happen overnight, it happened in small moments, in the subtle, day-to-day interactions that accumulated into something larger. His mission was no longer just about proving that he and his family belonged here, it was about creating a sense of unity that transcended color and background, about forging connections that could break down the walls of prejudice, one conversation at a time. And so, Marcus continued his efforts. He kept showing up, day after day, determined to be the change he wanted to see in the world around him. He knew that it wasn't enough to just be a good neighbor, he had to demonstrate, in every interaction, that his family was just as much a part of this community as anyone else. One afternoon, as Marcus was finishing up his yard work, he noticed a familiar figure walking down the street, Mr. Turner. The man's stern expression had softened somewhat since the barbecue, but there was still a noticeable distance between them. As Turner approached, Marcus stood up from his kneeling position, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Good afternoon, Mr. Turner," Marcus called, trying to maintain the warmth he'd cultivated over the past few weeks. Turner looked up, startled for a moment, before his expression relaxed. He gave a brief nod but didn't immediately respond. "Do you need something?" Marcus asked, trying to bridge the gap. "Well," Turner hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I just wanted to apologize, about what happened a while back. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. I've been thinking a lot about it, and I can see now that I was wrong." Marcus stood still, unsure of how to respond at first. This was the last thing he'd expected from his neighbor, someone who had been so quick to judge and so determined to make them feel unwelcome. But Marcus knew that it wasn't about expecting an apology, it was about seizing the opportunity for reconciliation. "I appreciate you saying that," Marcus replied, keeping his tone measured. "It means a lot that you're willing to acknowledge it." Turner shifted uncomfortably but continued. "I guess I've been worried. You know, about what's happening to this neighborhood. Things are changing, and I didn't want to lose what I've always known." Marcus nodded, understanding where Turner was coming from, even if he didn't fully agree with his perspective. "Change is always difficult," Marcus said. "But it doesn't have to be a bad thing. People moving in, new families joining the community, it can only make this place stronger. More diverse. And that diversity is what makes a neighborhood truly special." Turner didn't immediately respond, but there was a shift in his demeanor, something unspoken but noticeable. He was listening. Marcus took a deep breath, sensing the opportunity to push the conversation further. "You know, Mr. Turner," Marcus said thoughtfully, "I get it. When you've lived in a place for a long time, you become protective of it. But what we bring to this neighborhood isn't a threat, it's an opportunity. We've worked hard to be here. We want to contribute to this community. To be good neighbors." Turner finally looked Marcus in the eye, and for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of understanding. It was small, but it was there. I'll think about that," Turner muttered, his voice softer than usual. He paused, then added, "Maybe we can have a chat sometime, you know, when it's convenient. I've got a lot to learn." "That would be great," Marcus said, smiling. "I'll bring the coffee." For a moment, the two men stood there, an unspoken truce hanging between them. As Turner walked away, Marcus felt a sense of cautious optimism. This was progress, slow but steady. And even if it didn't mean immediate acceptance, it meant something more valuable, the possibility of change. As the days passed, Marcus's belief in the power of dialogue continued to strengthen. He found himself making more and more connections with other neighbors, some who had been initially distant, some who had been outright hostile. He took the time to listen to their concerns, to understand their fears and prejudices, and to gently challenge their assumptions. One of the most surprising developments came from an unlikely source, Mrs. Richardson, the neighbor who had initially seemed the most indifferent to Marcus and his family. She was an older woman, quiet and reserved, who had lived in the neighborhood for years. But after the barbecue, she had slowly started engaging with Marcus, offering him kind words in passing and even stopping to chat when they happened to cross paths. One afternoon, as Marcus was trimming the hedges in his front yard, Mrs. Richardson approached with a plate of freshly baked cookies. "I thought you might like these," she said with a warm smile, handing them to Marcus. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Richardson," Marcus replied, accepting the plate. "How's everything going?" "Better, I think," she said, her expression thoughtful. "I've been talking to a few of the other neighbors, and I think they're starting to see things differently. Maybe we all just needed a little push. A little reminder that we're not all so different." Marcus smiled, grateful for her words. "That's all it takes," he said. "A little bit of understanding, a little bit of empathy." And just like that, another barrier had been broken. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over time, Marcus continued to build on these small victories, piece by piece, until they formed a foundation of trust and camaraderie. It wasn't the full, unyielding acceptance he had hoped for, but it was progress. And in the face of adversity, that was all he could ask for. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus saw more and more of his neighbors beginning to stand alongside him, openly challenging the prejudices that had once defined their interactions. People who had once been quiet were now speaking up, offering support when Mr. Turner's old attitudes reared their head. And slowly but surely, the fabric of the community was beginning to change. It was a long, slow process, but Marcus was no longer just a new face in the crowd. He was a part of this neighborhood, a part of the story that was still being written. And that, he realized, was the most important thing of all. Facing the past and building a future. The days blurred into weeks, and the quiet streets of the neighborhood began to feel more like home to Marcus and his family. The sense of isolation that had once settled like a thick fog over their lives started to lift, replaced by a newfound sense of belonging. Marcus couldn't deny the effort it had taken, the countless conversations, the awkward pauses, the subtle glances of distrust, but as the months passed, he could feel the walls coming down, brick by brick. There were still challenges to face, but there was also progress. However, the work wasn't over. The seed of suspicion planted by Mr. Turner continued to sprout in quiet corners of the neighborhood, and Marcus knew that for every small victory, there would be another hurdle to overcome. One evening, as Marcus sat on the porch watching his children play in the yard, a car pulled up slowly in front of his house. His heart sank as he saw the familiar figure of Mr. Turner sitting behind the wheel. The man had been quieter in recent days, and Marcus had hoped that their brief exchange a few weeks ago would have signaled the end of the animosity between them. But as the car stopped, Marcus realized that this was not a friendly visit. Mr. Turner stepped out of the car, his face unreadable. For a moment, Marcus considered ignoring him. After all, hadn't they already discussed everything that needed to be said? But then, something inside him stirred, a sense of responsibility to finish what he had started. He stood up from the porch swing and walked toward his neighbor, his movements deliberate but unhurried. "Good evening, Mr. Turner," Marcus called, his voice calm. Turner looked up, his eyes briefly meeting Marcus's before he quickly glanced away, as if unsure of how to proceed. "Evening," he said shortly, his tone still guarded. There was an awkward pause, the kind of silence that often followed uncomfortable conversations between people who had once been strangers but were now forced to confront their differences. Finally, Mr. Turner broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice quieter now. "About what we talked about before. About you and your family being here." Marcus crossed his arms and nodded. "I appreciate that," he replied. "It's not easy, I know. Change never is." Turner looked down at the ground, his hands fidgeting with the keys in his pocket. "It's just. I don't know. I've spent so many years here, and now things are different. I've heard things, seen things that don't sit right with me. And I don't know how to make sense of it." Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. He could feel the weight of the conversation coming, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. "I understand," he said. "Change is uncomfortable. It shakes things up. But that's not always a bad thing." Turner's eyes flicked back to Marcus, searching his face for any hint of malice or anger. But Marcus held his gaze with a calmness that surprised even him. "You think I don't belong here?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but with an edge of emotion just beneath the surface. Turner hesitated, clearly torn. "I didn't know how to feel about it, but I've been listening. Talking to some of the neighbors. And I've realized that it's not just about what's changing. It's about who's changing. I've seen how you've tried to fit in. How your family's tried to fit in." Marcus let out a breath, not sure how to respond. There was an apology in Turner's voice, but it was wrapped in layers of hesitation and pride. "It shouldn't have taken this long," Marcus said quietly. "You shouldn't have had to second-guess us in the first place." Turner flinched slightly at the words, but he didn't deny them. "You're right," he admitted, his voice soft. "And I'm sorry for what I've said, for what I've thought. It's just hard, you know. I've always lived here, and I didn't want things to change. But I can see now that you and your family aren't the problem. The problem is me. And people like me. People who are afraid of what they don't understand." Marcus felt a mixture of relief and sadness wash over him. It was the apology he had wanted, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt more like a slow, painful unraveling of years of prejudice, of fear and suspicion that had never truly been confronted. And yet, Marcus knew that this was the moment of transformation, this was where the real work would begin. "We can't change the past, Mr. Turner," Marcus said, his voice soft but firm. "But we can change how we move forward. How we choose to see each other. It's not about you and me, or your family and mine, it's about the future of this whole neighborhood. If we keep looking at each other with suspicion, then nothing will ever change. We'll just keep living in fear of what we don't understand." Turner nodded slowly, a frown creasing his brow as he absorbed Marcus's words. He seemed to struggle with something, unsure of how to proceed. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke again. "Maybe you're right," he said, almost to himself. "Maybe I need to change the way I see things. I've been too set in my ways. Too comfortable in my own bubble." Marcus smiled slightly, his arms still crossed as he studied his neighbor. "Comfort can be the hardest thing to break out of," he said. "But it's worth it." After another moment of uncomfortable silence, Turner offered a tentative hand. "I want to try, Marcus," he said, his voice sincere but still edged with uncertainty. "I want to be better." Marcus hesitated, but then, in an act that felt both symbolic and necessary, he took Turner's hand and shook it firmly. "I appreciate that," Marcus said quietly. "And I'll be here, ready when you are." Over the next few weeks, the dynamic between Marcus and Mr. Turner began to shift. Turner, although still guarded, made small gestures toward reconciliation. He started to nod in passing, offering the occasional greeting. And though the community still carried the weight of past divisions, Marcus could see that things were improving. Slowly, the once cloistered, insular neighborhood was becoming something new, something larger than just the sum of its parts. But as Marcus walked through the neighborhood one evening, his thoughts were interrupted by the sharp ring of his phone. He pulled it from his pocket and saw a familiar name on the screen, Officer Taylor, the same officer who had arrived on his doorstep the night the accusations had first been made. With a deep breath, Marcus answered. "Hello. Mr. Davis," Officer Taylor's voice was calm but tinged with urgency. "I'm calling because there's something you should know. There's been a development." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "There have been more complaints filed," Taylor said. "About your family. We're still investigating, but I just wanted you to be aware. We'll be keeping an eye on the situation." Marcus felt a familiar pang of anger rise in his chest. "Are you serious?" he said, his voice shaking with frustration. "After everything we've been through, this is still happening?" "I know it's frustrating, but we're doing everything we can to address it," Officer Taylor said. "Just stay vigilant, all right? We don't want things to escalate." Marcus nodded, his grip tightening on the phone. He wasn't sure what this latest development meant, but one thing was clear, his fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done.